Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. Welcome to Growers Daily, your daily dose of ecological farming insight. It is Wednesday, December 11th, 2024, and today is gonna be a day that we talk about the phases of a farm, recovering from a rough season, and wood chips. So let's do it. All right, we are technically in the middle of the week now that it is Wednesday. Though for market farmers still doing market, this probably just feels like the beginning of the week or just part of the week. In fact, all of my life, I have had jobs where I worked the weekends. This daily show may be the first job I've ever had where I didn't actually work on a Saturday or Sunday, and I completely invented this job out of the ether. Maybe that's the trick when you don't have a college degree. Good to know. Okay, so now that we're in a new month and getting new questions on our Patreon page, I wanted to take today to catch up on a few of those Patreon questions from November for timeliness and just so I don't get to January with unanswered fall questions. Anyway, let's dive in because some of these are fun, like this one from Patreon member Joe Naaman Sessions. That is less of a question, but touches on something interesting to discuss. Joe writes, quote, after reading The One Straw Revolution, that's a book by Masanobu Fukuoka, all three of Ben Hartman's books, Helen Attow's Ecological Farm with an emphasis on haying living pathways into beds, and most importantly, every no-till growers video of Jesse Frost's wearing a pristine hat, I have to wonder, am I working too hard? My hat is disgusting and not even green anymore. Rather, it's turned a hard work burnt orange. Anyways, no serious question here other than I cannot wait to work to implement many of the aforementioned systems to reduce the workload, end quote. So thanks, Joe. I love this comment/question. First off, I should say that I don't wear my work hats in videos because they are gross and sun bleached. Kind of like this one, this red one that I'm wearing for this video that is usually tucked behind me here that we washed at one point, but you can see it's like super worn. But here's the thing that I think this comment touches on that's worth some elaboration. I think it's easy to look at me or Ben or whoever and see someone who doesn't work that hard on a day-to-day basis, but the reality is that one, we wear our nice hats for photo shoots and videos, but two, we're probably in a different phase of our farms. A farm has three main phases: the startup phase, the refinement phase, and the stable phase. The startup phase is, for lack of a non-food word, bananas. This is when you are building out all the infrastructure and hustling to get your markets established and your customer base and your growing skills up to par. The startup phase can take some farms a couple of years and other farms a decade. 5 to 10 years of hustle is what most farms will tell you it took to get them going. And that's about the amount of time I would account for, 5 to 10 years. The duration of this phase, the longest of the three, depends a lot on your startup capital, your know-how, your soil, the infrastructure, and your time. A farmer that is setting up a farm a couple hours every week after they get off work and on weekends is obviously going to take longer in this phase than one who can be there every day and has a partner or multiple partners to help. Now the second phase, the refinement phase, can happen somewhat concurrently with the first. You can be dialing in your systems and also building infrastructure simultaneously, but once that build-up phase ends, you move into a less intense phase of just refining systems. There may still be some big projects, but they are not happening all at once. This phase can be, and this is completely arbitrary, a couple years or a few. Then eventually you stabilize. And that's what you see with farms like Ben's and others, is farmers in a more stable phase. Yes, it has to do with their practices to some extent, but it mostly has to do with where they are in their farm's life, in their own lives. I use that phrase often, that comparison is the thief of joy, but it is wholly unfair to compare oneself to an established farm, to a farm that's in an advanced, stable phase. Try to only compare yourself to yourself would be my recommendation. Are you in a better place today than you were yesterday or last week or last month or last year? How can you set up yourself to be in a better place going forward? That's all that really matters, honestly. Social media skews our views on these things because we see the clean hats, the well-rested farmer, but what we don't see is that farmer in year 1 through 5. Or we see farmers trying to market themselves to new customers and not necessarily farmers trying to show what hashtag farm life is really all about. Though, of course, those accounts exist too, and they're important. It should also be said that phases can go back and forth. A stable phase can get frantic again for a bit if you move farms or expand or lose key employees or whatever. It's all part of entrepreneurship and small business ownership. But if you take it slow and smart and appreciate your improvements and not compare them to others, that's how you get to the stable phase, or a stable phase at least. Anyway, love the comment, Joe. Up next, we will get another Patreon question, this one on recovering from a rough season. Be right back. Today's episode of Growers Daily is brought to you by Tilth Soil. Tilth Soil is a worker-owned co-op in Cleveland, Ohio, making NOP-compliant living soils for organic growers. Everything from Tilth is compost-based, and they divert around 4,000 tons of food scraps from landfills each year. I have used Tilth Soil for several years now for my plant starts. I love the results. I get consistent germination and consistent growth, plus excellent customer support. It's a lovably nerdy cast of folks who run Tilth. So start your season with excellent germination and strong transplants. Check out Tilth's pre-sale pricing for the 2025 season at tilthsoil.com. That's tilthsoil.com, and click Farmers. All right, back to the show. Here's another gross hat. If you, the listener, are enjoying this podcast and would like to support it, you can do so over at patreon.com/no-till-growers. I will try to get to questions from everywhere that questions come in. But obviously, I focus on these Patreon questions because they are the ones who make this show possible. And they're awesome. I really appreciate you all. So today's second question comes from Little Row Farms, who writes, quote, "Hello." I love that with the exclamation point. Anyway, "Hello, love the podcast and books. Keep up the great work. Thanks, Little Row. This past year has been one of our most difficult years, the type that makes you want to hang it up after 4 years. Due to illness and other events, our garden became a jungle of weeds that went to seed, and the soil analysis is dismal at best. We are transitioning from conventional to a more low-till organic farm. I will not quit, so I am at a point where we are trying to rebuild for next year, but I am overwhelmed with where to start. We have decent infrastructure and tools available, tarps, access to compost, etc. We are in zone 7 and winter is approaching. Any suggestions on what to do when it all derails? Thanks." End quote. So this is a great question, Little Row Farms, and an important one. Especially in the early years, things are going to occasionally get away from you. Without knowing your exact growing experience or what the gardens look like before you started your gardens, or how they were established. In other words, I can only offer some general advice, but hopefully it will be helpful to you or anyone in a similar situation. First, I know you mentioned illness, and I'm sorry to hear that. I have been through a few ill-timed illnesses myself over my farming career, and of course, we all hope whatever it was has been resolved and you or that person are back to health. Going down in the middle of the season can be incredibly disrupting, even to the best of farms and farmers. That in mind, again, there's a lot I don't know about your situation, but here are some general thoughts that might be helpful. One, are you growing on more land than you need? Sometimes weeds can be an indication that you're simply spread a little bit too thin. Would it be possible to dial back your production a bit, maybe drop some of the crops that are lower in profitability or utility for you? It may feel counterintuitive to some extent, but shrinking can often be more productive and more profitable, but also just less weeds because you simply have less space to tend. As for the soil and dismal soil test, perhaps getting your soil back in a healthy state will make a huge difference as well. Since you said it had been farmed conventionally for some time, perhaps treating it simply like a brand new plot and getting the foundation set before going into your next season would not be the worst idea for long-term success. Get some good compost down and follow soil amending recommendations from a good agronomist who understands nutrient balancing. Then work that into the soil. I don't think that would be the worst approach. It'd be a good investment in the future of that garden space. Compaction and depleted soils often follow conventional systems, so it's worth considering treating it like a brand new plot. Also, develop a very vigilant weed suppressing regimen this upcoming season. You mentioned being low till, which I imagine is a tilther or a power harrow or a tiller with a precision depth roller or something to that effect, like within the top few inches. Well, there's a reason that practitioners of those sorts of methods often use a lot of cultivation tools. Weeds love any sort of disturbance like that. So you need to make sure to cultivate the beds, hoe them, or whatever regularly. Our rule when we were a tillage and then a low tillage farm was that we cultivated the soil before planting as well as we could. Stale seed bedding where possible, basically preparing the soil to plant and then not planting, instead allowing the weeds to germinate, cultivating them and then planting. And then we cultivated after every single rain once the crop was in. No excuses. It was exhausting, but in the beginning, sometimes that's what it takes to get the weed bank in check. The tarp can also come in handy to fix mistakes or prep soil for planting, but it's limited a bit by certain weeds that don't germinate without sunlight. The winter is nice because you can develop a plan for the garden, but you can also plan around the weedier areas. In the weediest spots, avoid direct seeding, obviously, but I would also avoid slow crops in those areas. Slow crops being like sweet potatoes or winter squash or something like that. I like to put crops like transplanted lettuces or some short season beets in places where I have a potential noxious weed issue, because I know I will stay on top of it and that crop will be out in 3 or 4 weeks. I'll clean the bed again and then transplant something else, something in that similar vein, under 50, 60 days to maturity. Mulching will also obviously help with weed suppression, but that's not an option for everyone. So if you like your system but don't like the weeds, work on the weed management strategy and maybe gear your plantings around those tarps so that they can help reduce that weed pressure before and after, and make a deal to yourself. This year, no seed rain, meaning no weeds going to seed. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. Appreciate the question a ton, Little Rural Farms, and I definitely hope next season is a prosperous one. Okay, let's take one more quick break, and when we return, let's talk wood chips. Be right back. All right, so for the final segment, we're going to take a question from our dear friend and Patreon member, Nate Merkel, who writes, quote, I'd love to hear your thoughts looking into wood chip science specifically. To what degree does nitrogen really get temporarily tied up? I find wood chips to be the easiest resource to get here in large amounts for free. I've been thinking a lot about utilizing wood chips to cover beds that were in production late enough to not get a cover crop. I'd rather not buy straw if I don't have to. Anyways, thinking about covering beds with wood chips and treating it like straw, etc., and possibly raking it into the aisles in the spring. From some of the research I've been able to find, it doesn't actually seem like the nitrogen tie-up is as drastic as the belief. And when it is happening, it's really only at the soil/wood chip interface and minimally plus temporarily at that. What's the data say about all this? End quote. Okay, so great question, Nate. And I too am occasionally, at least, in a similar boat where wood chips are the organic resource I can get most readily and most affordably, which would be free. Though, pro tip, always trade something if you can, because that will keep them coming back to your wood chip people. Anyway, and I love wood chips for all their potential in the garden or compost pile. I would love to use them more on bed surfaces, but the reason I don't is less to do with the nitrogen tie-up and more to do with a couple of other factors. The first is that there is some evidence from a study in the late 90s that at least temporarily some fresh wood chips may leach acids into the soil that alter the soil pH. This evidence is often written off because the samples were taken at the soil surface just below the mulch, or other studies have shown it goes down only a couple or a few inches. But one, in annual vegetable production, those first few inches of the soil are important. And two, in annual vegetable production, temporary effects on the soil are a big deal. Now, provided you don't add more wood chips, the soil pH will rebound and the soil will be all the better off for the nutrients given to it by the wood chips. But fresh wood chips on a fresh garden could mean a slight but potentially significant, depending on the wood, change in pH. A lot of the pro wood chip mulch material information that I see out there is for perennial trees and ornamentals, which I think is often confused for general gardening information, gardening guidelines. Vegetables are, by and large, much more sensitive to surface level changes in chemistry than deep-rooted perennials are. Now, in terms of the nitrogen tie-up, like Nate said, that is mostly only happening where the wood chips are touching. That's why you definitely don't want to work them into the soil you hope to use anytime soon, because then every part of that wood chip is tying up nitrogen, right? Because it's all about surface area instead of it's just that little bit that's touching the soil surface, like if you use it like a mulch. Again, shallow-rooted crops may be affected by that tie-up more than deeper-rooted crops. To the question of how long the nitrogen tie-up will last, that's a toughie only because it depends on moisture, temperature, and if we're talking about partially decomposed wood chips or versus fresh ones, etc. Now, nitrogen is often a reason why you see folks who use the quote unquote back to Eden method, often laying down a thick layer of compost before the mulch, before the kind of mulch layer of wood chips. The compost prevents excessive nitrogen tie-up. Now, of course, wood chips can increase slug habitat and the potential for fungal diseases, especially around the stem of the plant. What I have done, and I believe I've mentioned this before on this podcast, is use partially decomposed wood chips to mulch around tomatoes and elephant garlic to some extent. Some of the elephant garlic were covered in fungi at harvest, making them less marketable. The skin was literally like kind of eaten off by fungi, but they mostly survived. To your point about raking them into the path, this I would be curious to know how it affects the soil, or is it positive, negative, neutral? I don't know. Like you suggested, Nate, I would love to see if someone could add wood chips in the fall to put those beds to rest for the winter and then rake them off in the spring into the pathways as a pathway mulch. Would that provide any benefits to the bed soil beyond coverage, or would it be taking some nitrogen and soil particles off with it? Would it change the soil pH for a while in the spring? My guess, which is not scientific, is that it would depend on how long the chips are on there and how early in the spring we're talking. I don't think the pH issue would persist for very long, but it's hard to say. Without testing this idea specifically, there's just really no way of knowing. There's also simply the issue of the mulch keeping the soil extra cool over the winter. So in the spring, unless you allowed for ample warm-up time, perhaps under a tarp, you would be prolonging the winter soil temps with a lightly colored mulch, in this case the wood chips, which would make everything grow a little bit more slowly. Anyway, I love the wood chips for certain applications, and I'm happy to try and do some temporary mulching experiments with them, but definitely hesitate to recommend wood chips as a mulch still. Again, like all trials, start small, see how it goes. In the spring, raking them off and then planting into those beds. Maybe you can compare it to a couple beds that didn't get the chips. Otherwise, I think I'm going to leave it there. If you would like to learn more about our production methods in general, obviously this show is a good source for that, and we've done a lot of videos, but also the Living Soil Handbook. With that, when you get it from no-tillgrowers.com, helps to support our work. Huge shouts to Willie Breeding for the theme music and the team at No Till Growers for their support. Also, I forget to shout out Epidemic Sound, where we get this music that you hear right now. That is from a royalty-free website called Epidemic Sound that we pay for, and we really appreciate. Some good tunes over there. Big shout out to everyone over at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, where at a certain level, or if you just bump up from one level to another, or sign up in the month of December, you get a shout out on the show. So big shout outs today to some of the Earthworm. Anytime you sign up for Earthworm, you get like a double shout out. You get the original shout out, and then a month later, you get an extra shout out. So it's like 2 shout outs for one. So today we have Joey Thomas Pilgrim, Alex Shade. I think I remember that one from last month. Jennifer. Good old Jennifer. And then we have George Baker. Oh, Thranduil Rex. Thranduil Rex? Thranduil Rex? I think that's right. I probably got that. Nailed it. And Lamb's Quarters Farm. So this story is actually takes place in, I think it was Milwaukee. And this group they were just all hanging out. They were out for coffee. They were just minding their business. And then poof, robot insurrection, which they just spring up anywhere these days. And these robots in particular were actually, like they worked for, a big, let's just call it like a drop shipping company. And they decided to start, taking everybody's coffee. And George and Thranduil Rex and Lamb's Quarters Farms and Joey and Alex and Jennifer all managed to fight them off, and then took up arms and managed to beat the robot insurrection back. It was a big, harrowing story, and there were the writing was really good. There's lots of catchy lines, very smart, and some good cameos from Milwaukee. Yeah, just famous Milwaukee folk. It was great. Very fun stuff. Anyway, thanks for watching or listening. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye.